In 2019, Kiehl's pledged to reduce 50% of its single-use polythene usage in stores by 2025. So far, on a monthly basis, we inspired 38,000 shoppers to switch to reusable bags and around 108 shoppers to bring their own containers for shopping. We replaced 132,000 plastic straws with paper straws while continuing to look for a sustainable solution for juice cups. Our top crust bread bags were replaced with compostable bags, reducing over 20,000 single-use polythene bags a day. Our fish, meat, fruit and vegetable counters also switched to compostable bags. That's not all. We continue to build awareness among our staff on the importance of reducing polythene usage and walk the journey towards reducing our impact on the environment, because together we can.
Blue Resources Trust is a Sri Lankan NGO. We started work in 2016. Primary areas of focus are coral reef conservation and elasmobranch fisheries. We also help the government with policy work and MPA management. So since we started our fisheries project, we have surveyed nearly 20 harbours and landing sites all across the country. What we've done for the last 3 years is focus more on data collection from the lesser known and smaller landing sites, because very little to no data exists from these sites. When we go to the fish market, we take photos to know what species are being landed. We take measurements of those specimens that are landed. We also take DNA samples from the specimens at the fish markets. Since August of 2017, we've documented 13,000 specimens consisting of 40 species of rays and 43 species of sharks. From these specimens, we have collected over 3,000 DNA samples. The reason we study sharks and rays is because these animals are very vulnerable to overfishing. Unlike other fish, their life cycle and life histories resemble land animals like elephants and leopards more than fish like tuna. Most sharks and rays live for a long time. They have very few young. They reproduce only once every few years. All of this makes them very vulnerable to overfishing. There are many different fishing methods used in Sri Lanka, depending on the size of the boat and the weather. While there are a few targeted shark and ray fisheries, most of them are bycatch in the long line and the gill net fisheries of Sri Lanka. Although shark and ray meat is consumed in Sri Lanka, it's not very valuable. The biggest value from the shark and ray fishery comes from the export of the shark fins and the gill plates of mobulas. These species are apex predators, and protecting them is vital to maintaining a healthy ecosystem. In the end, all fisheries rely on a healthy ecosystem in the ocean.
The ocean. Our island is surrounded by it. We live in the midst of it. Mesmerizing. Enthralling. Pleasing. Our ocean is unique, a vibrant marine habitat. We have loyal whales who never leave our seas. Turtles who always return to our shorelines. Mangroves sequestering carbon. Dugongs gliding beneath the waves. Seagrass meadows pumping oxygen we breathe. underwater reefs sheltering marine life. But they're struggling. Coral reefs bleached. Our seabeds scraped over by foreign fishing trawlers. We're depleting our marine life through overfishing. Plastic and chemical waste pollution gush into our oceans. Coastal sand is disappearing. Marine animals killed by dynamite. Turtles entangling in goose nets. Ships colliding with whales. Climate change. Global warming. Oil spills. Coastal construction. Ocean acidification. Ocean's life is draining. We need the ocean. Our survival depends on it. The sea around us is now a hotspot for geopolitics, trade, security, maritime ventures, and crime. Our impact on the ocean matters. Our ocean is our lungs, our hearts, our nerves. Without it, no one can survive. We can only thrive if our oceans survive. Let's strive to be the guardians of the ocean. Let us be the protectors, together, for our ocean.
Hello everyone, welcome all of you to the World Oceans Day Summit session on threatened marine biodiversity. I'm Amila Sumanapala. I'm a member of the Pearl Protectors as well as a conservation biologist working on Sri Lankan researching and doing conservation work on Sri Lankan biodiversity. So today this session is on threatened marine biodiversity and it's under the theme ocean biodiversity of Sri Lanka. So we have a panel of experts for you, and I would like to welcome Mr. Daniel Fernando. Daniel is a Sri Lankan marine biologist and the co-founder of the Blue Resource Trust. He is an expert on sharks and rays, and he is also providing his expertise to shark conservation policy management conventions like CITES, CMS, and IUCN expert groups. Then we have Dr. Asha de Vos, who is a renowned marine biologist working on marine mammals. She has been involved with long-term studies on blue whales in the northern Indian Ocean, as well as she is also the founder of the organization Oceans Web. And we also have Mr. Ranil Nanayakkara, who is a conservation biologist specializing in terrestrial and marine mammals. He has worked with many leading marine conservation organizations over the years, and also worked on several threatened marine mammal species in Sri Lanka. So these are the expert panel that we have today. So we'll be discussing marine biodiversity, the threatened marine species that we have, the issues that the threatened species are facing, and what we can and what we should be doing for their conservation. So the Oceans Day Summit or World Oceans Day Summit is hosted by the Pearl Protectors in collaboration with the Marine Environmental Protection Authority as well as the Blue Resource Trust. and the World Ocean Day organization. So I would like to ask all our audience, if you have any questions, any interesting questions related to our topic, please feel free to ask the questions as a comment in any of our live live feeds in Facebook or YouTube. Right. Let's move on to the discussion. So we'll be discussing the marine life and the threatened species in Sri Lanka. To start our discussion, Daniel, let's start with you. We know Sri Lanka is completely surrounded by ocean, and we have a very remarkable biodiversity. What kind of sharks and rays are found in Sri Lanka? What kind of a diversity do we have?
Thank you, Amila. Yeah, when we talk about sharks and rays, many people are probably not aware that we have quite a few different species all across the island. These species are found, in every single area, both in shallow and deep waters, and some of them are even found in freshwater rivers. I think the few of you who would have seen sharks have probably seen them at Pigeon Island, because this is one of the few places in the country where you can consistently encounter them alive. But unfortunately, for most other sharks and rays, they're just not as common as they used to be. This is mostly due to the fact that they have been severely overfished and their populations have depleted. And this also makes it very challenging for us to determine how many different types of species are present. And of course, unlike on the land, we can't just walk and go and count them. We have to rely on, for example, fisheries landing, so the catch that fishers bring in. And then we have another issue, because until very recently, not much data has actually been collected on these animals. And when we look at all these issues together, it's actually very difficult for us to say exactly how many different types of sharks and rays we have. What we do know is that based on, for example, past species checklists that have been carried out in Sri Lanka, such as the one by Rex de Silva, but also, for example, our own checklist that has been based on several years of data collection now. What we can say is that we are confident that there are at least about 100 different species of sharks and rays in the country. It's probably split equally around 50 sharks and 50 rays. The number is probably a bit higher, but again, it's difficult to say for sure. What I would like to add is that, from our research that we have conducted in the last few years, our team has actually found quite a few interesting discoveries. So, for example, we had about 6 range extensions. So these are species that were known from other parts of the world, but were not known to occur in Sri Lanka. But in addition to these range extensions, what we found was that there were about 5 or 6 species that appear to be new to science. And this is not just new species to Sri Lanka, this is a new species internationally. So this is, really incredible. And at the same time, while it's quite exciting, it is a bit boring, especially from a management perspective, because how are we going to manage what we don't even know exists in our waters?
True. And it's amazing, to know that kind of remarkable diversity is out there. And I know your findings are probably that will, introduce many new species as well as new records. That's really interesting to know, because when we talk about sharks, we only think about several species. So knowing that such diversity out there is very interesting. So moving on to the mammals, let's say a little bit more familiar to us, the marine mammals. Dr. Asha, what can could you please explain the diversity of whales that you can find in Sri Lanka? I know you have been working with these animals for so long. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, absolutely. In Sri Lanka, if we just use a number, we have about 28 species of whales, dolphins, and of course, 1 species of dugong. But, as you might know, these are very incomplete lists. So just like Daniel says, there are huge challenges to kind of trying to identify species in our waters. For us, we have to go out into the ocean most times to be able to document them. And so that's quite tricky. Obviously, it's expensive and it takes a lot of time and effort. But as we've been going out over the years, we've also been able to document a lot of, know where these animals are, but then we've also had new species that we've documented. For example, a few years ago, we documented the Omiraz whale, which is a rather large whale. It can grow up to about 30 feet, but we didn't know it really existed in our waters until we, managed to get proper photographs of it and compare it with everything else out there. Now, the tricky thing here, just as Daniel says, is that if if we're overlooking the species, so, we don't know what's out there. And if we're overlooking species that can go to 30 feet, then what else are we overlooking in our oceans? So that's something really important for us to think about. The other thing to consider with marine mammals is that they are very elusive, right? So we are seeing a tiny portion of their lives when they come up to the surface to breathe. That's about it. And only when they come into our coastline. So when access has to be very, it has to be a very accessible spot. And that has often been a challenge as well, right? So do we have complete surveys along our coastline? I mean, I've sailed, I'd say 95% of our coastline in search of marine mammals. But again, there are challenges related to that in terms of infrastructure and costs. So we would have to do lots of that to be able to really unravel what's out there. But the good thing is we know that there is more out there. And the more we do this work, the more people come into this field, the more opportunity there is for us to identify the species and look after them better based on their needs.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, even though we know we are kind of familiar with them, there are so many things that are still unknown to us. And moving on to Ranil, you also have worked on marine mammals, as well as you have a general interest on all the wildlife in Sri Lanka. So what can you add to this? What can you say about the marine diversity in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, well, speaking about now, since Asha touched on the whales, and I'll just mention about the dolphins, really. We have about 23 species of dolphins. So they're broken down in, toothed whales, really. We have 23 species, and within that, you have species like the beaked whales, which are researched they're so elusive and their surface behavior is so unobtrusive that certain species of beaked whales we have recorded their vocalization during our marine surveys, but we are yet to see the animal. So what we have really done is we have sort of collaborated with international organizations and tried to ascertain which species these sounds have been emitted from. And also at the same time we have which I personally work on, is the humpback dolphins, the dugongs, and the finless porpoise, which is really found, mainly in the northwestern and northern part of the country. And our recent surveys have shown that, there are pocketed fragmented populations in the southeast, and also in the northeast as well. So this really shows that, the diversity, and especially after the 30-year-long war, the country was only opened up to researchers such as ourselves only very, very recently, 10 years ago. And within that 10 years, we have, recorded a lot of species because certain areas were inaccessible to us. And also there are several records of, even rare birds, like, breeding colonies of birds in the Pork Strait, like the brown noddy, then, the brindle tern, the greater crested tern. So this is very, very important. These are things that are only coming into light now. And also, after the war ended, we got to know about the large aggregations of sperm whales in the eastern half of the Gulf of Mannar. And we have been following it since 2010 to date. When I say to date, basically last 2 years we lost out on. So we have seen a huge difference there, of what we know, the knowledge we gain. And especially people like Asha, then Daniel, what they have done has really added a lot more to the little knowledge we had on the marine sphere altogether.
Thank you, Ranil. That was very interesting, especially that you mentioned the seabirds and pelagic birds in Sri Lanka, because when you think about marine diversity, when you discuss marine diversity, the birds are not a group that you usually think of. So you usually think of fish and other aquatic animals. So it's really interesting, and of course we have a remarkable diversity of pelagic birds that are very important as well, and all the dolphins and other marine mammal species that you just discussed. So moving on to more flagship species, the species that we have been studying and we have been using as flagships in Sri Lanka. Daniel, what can you tell us about the important rays and sharks in Sri Lanka? Any critical species, any threatened groups that you want to discuss?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I wish we had more time for this. It's not easy just to pick one or two species, and that's quite a sad thing to say, because the reality is a lot of these species are facing really severe threats at the moment. Looking just specifically at sharks and rays, but of course this is similar to similar for
okay, right.
Okay, sorry, there's a bit of a lag on the line, I believe. So similar to a lot of other species, I would say that the biggest threat that many of them are facing is simply overfishing. With the sharks and rays, we are catching them a lot faster than they can reproduce in the wild. And we are catching them for a lot of reasons: for their meat, their fins, oil, skin, cartilage, teeth, jaws. So while it's good that we're utilizing as much of these species as possible when we capture them, the reality is we are still catching too many of them. We also have big threats, or rather these species are facing big threats as a consequence of a loss or degradation of their natural habitats. This could be also due to unsustainable fishing practices sometimes, for example, like bottom trawling or dynamite fishing. But it's also due to terrestrial runoffs that impact coral reefs, poorly developed aquaculture projects that destroy mangroves and other coastal ecosystems. And then, of course, the other big issues that we are all very familiar with, for example, climate change, plastic pollution, all of these have impacts. And when you combine them all together, particularly this issue of overfishing, on species that have incredibly conservative biological life histories, it becomes a really big problem. We have to remember that sharks and rays are not like other fish. In fact, many of them, similar to a lot of the larger cetaceans like the blue whales, they have life cycles that are actually a lot more closely related to elephants and leopards than to other fish like tuna. And yet, we do not afford most sharks and rays the same level of protection that we do to elephants, leopards, and also to the blue whales. Just to give you one example, some research that we recently conducted was on the sawfish. This is a species that we have not encountered in almost 4 years of surveys now, but it's a species that is supposed to exist in Sri Lanka, and we know that it definitely did. We interviewed about 300 fishers across the country, and what we found out was that only about 110 out of these 300 had ever seen a sawfish. And out of these 110, only half had seen one since 1992. So, this, along with a lot of the other data we collected during this study, was a very clear indicator that these species have declined and are now probably on the verge of extinction. They're definitely already commercially extinct, and they're probably on the verge of complete extinction now. And there are lots of other similar species, similar to the sawfish, such as the rhino rays, which is basically a family. The more common names are the guitar fish and the wedge fish. And if we don't have management in place for some of these, they are going to follow in the same footsteps as the sawfish. And I think this is something that we really have to change when we are thinking about species like sharks and rays, is that we need proactive management. For too long, we have been having reactionary measures So, we've been bringing about measures once we have seen the species almost collapse or almost go extinct. And we need to switch this around to start managing them before they get to this incredibly threatened stage. So yeah, to sum up, unfortunately, a lot of the species in Sri Lanka are incredibly threatened. Many of them are critically endangered. And yeah, if we don't do something now, we are going to lose a lot of them in the near future.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Sorry for the interruption earlier. And that's a devastating story. I mean, though we have a lot of diversity, we are yet to understand it fully and to have conservation prioritized, species prioritized, and knowing that so many species are critically endangered, knowing that so many species are threatened in our waters is really a devastating situation. And moving on to the marine mammals again, Dr. Asha, what can you you have been working on blue whales and other flagship species earlier. So what's your experience with them? What kind of important species are out there, and what are the certain species? What are the conservation priorities that we have? Dr. Asha, you're on mute.
I answered my whole question in that time. Just joking. No, so I was just going to say basically that, that's a really tough question to ask, because if we look at, the IUCN red list, for example, and you Google, you type in the names of the species that we have in our waters, which, as we've discussed, are many, you have this very global status, right? Which doesn't necessarily apply in different ocean basins. So, for example, like the blue whales out here, we know that they're really unique, right? They feed on different things. Everywhere else in the world, they feed on krill. In Sri Lanka, they're feeding on a kind of shrimp. Their behaviors are different. They're very dependent on this particular environment, and they're adapted to not migrating out of these warm tropical waters, right? So number one, we can't have blanket conservation rules across the board, and we can't have blanket statuses either. So that's really important for us to remember. But it's also a lot of work, a lot of money, and a lot of time to go and assess the current status of a lot of these species, right? Because it takes time. You have to do various kinds of surveys to assess, to get the information, right? So we depend a lot on photo identification to try to assess numbers, but that's a slow process. And so we don't actually even know what the threat status of a lot of our species are. Now, if we talk about sperm whales, right? So we have these giant pods that I think Ranil will probably talk about a bit more as well. But, from my perspective, from the work that we do with sperm whales, we're really interested in the concept of culture, right? And when I say that, right, culture is where you have, in sperm whales, you have units. You'll have the grandmother, the mothers, and then their kids. They live together, right? And then they come together at some point when there are bigger groups. But in general, these are their groups. Within each group, they have a different culture. They'll have a different dialect in each particular group. And then overall in that group that uses that area, they will also have a common dialect, right? So when we talk about like threat status of these species, it's not okay for us to get rid of like one of those units. We're losing a whole culture if we do that. If we get rid of all the sperm whales in Sri Lankan waters, and we say, okay, there are 10,000 sperm whales across the world. If we lose the 2,000, I don't know what the number is, but I'm just saying in Sri Lankan waters, it's okay. It's not, because you lose an entire culture that has evolved over a long period of time, right? So these are really important concepts that I think are often missed when we talk about conservation and we talk about just numbers. It's not just number. It's much more than that. And assessing marine mammals in general, unless they're smaller water bodies, it can be really tricky, especially these very mobile, highly mobile, large, elusive species that we work with.
Yeah, that's a very interesting input. I mean, we talk about cultures when you discuss the human civilization. When you discuss the populations, human populations, you talk about culture. But when it comes to mammals, even marine mammals, you really don't take that into account. But knowing that it's different out there, each different population is different, and knowing that it's a different evolutionary unit that need to be conserved is really important, and kind of a pioneering step in moving forward with conservation implications. And moving on to other marine mammals, Ranil, what can you have been working with several threatened groups that are globally recognized as threatened species. What's your experience with them?
Yeah, well, speaking on the especially the dugong. I would take, since it's the only extant living species that belongs to the family Dugonidae, and its unique sort of behavior and ecology, being a total seagrass dependent, so, and it really relies on the remaining seagrass beds that what is found in Sri Lanka. And what we have seen is, the population that we have in Sri Lanka, we basically share with India as well. So the dugong moves to and from between in the Indian waters to Sri Lankan waters, and likewise from Sri Lankan waters to Indian waters once certain areas of the seagrass bed is sort of exhausted. What they have been a grazer like cattle on land, they basically graze on the seagrass, and once it's exhausted, they move on to the other side and allow this if they fed on the Sri Lankan side, they allow the Sri Lankan side to regenerate and move on. So, and it is a very important species because it basically helps to keep the seagrass ecosystem healthy. And the seagrass ecosystem as a whole, like I believe the previous speakers who spoke on the seagrass ecosystem would have mentioned and highlighted it, it's a sort of a nursery ground for a lot of threatened species, and especially species like what Daniel works on, rays and sharks and so on. And also I would like to add on to what Asha said about the sperm whales. What we have seen is we have been doing a lot of acoustic research and the vocalization of sperm whales, and we have been comparing it with other populations found in the Indian Ocean, and there are several papers we have done which will be published very soon at the INPRESS. Actually, we are comparing with the Western Indian Ocean from the mascarenes like Madagascar, Reunion, and the dialect in Sri Lanka is totally different to the populations found in the Madagascan waters and Reunion and Mauritius and so on. To give an example, now they have a click. I don't have the recordings with me, but they have a click pattern. Say you get tuck, 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 tuck in Sri Lanka, but in that area, the click pattern differs like tuck, tuck. There'll be a pause between the clicks. And we are working with a few other international organizations. That's how we have been comparing, data with them. So these are all new things to us in Sri Lanka, and especially, being and generally you get this sort of diversity and stuff in oceanic islands, but Sri Lanka, being a continental island, we are in par with places like the Azores and the Bahamas and so on. So yeah, we are still learning, and it's good that a lot more people are coming into studying cetaceans and also sharks and rays and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that again, just like it was discussed earlier, knowing that there are evolutionary distinct units out there, and knowing that these species can move really. I mean, doing conservation work alone in Sri Lanka doesn't help, not going to help them in the long run. You need to have a regional level conservation efforts to conserve these animals actually. And again, moving to discussing more on marine mammals. I mean, with all these, this recent incident with the ship with the Pearl Express, and with lot of other incidents, we know that shipping can have a negative impact. The ship lines can have negative impacts on our marine biodiversity. Dr. Asha, can you please enlighten us on this? You have worked with ships, you have worked with these shipping lines in maritime transportation and in that field. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So shipping is the #1 threat for most large whale species across the world. It's something that I have been focusing on for many years now. It's a pretty much a pretty simple problem, as in if you get whales and you get and the whales use particular areas because they're very productive, they go there to feed. And if you have a shipping lane on top of that, obviously you're going to have collisions, right? So that's obviously something that's significant. It happens in Sri Lanka. It's a tricky problem because quite often these carcasses will fall and sink offshore. Sometimes we get evidence like that image you just saw where it'll get washed, it'll come in on the front of a container ship or something. We can document this. But research in California, where they face the same problem with blue whales, they have calculated that for every individual that gets documented, we get documented evidence that it was killed by a ship. Another 10 times more are undocumented, right? So it is a bigger problem than we think. And also it's important for us to remember that this is like it's a issue we're all to blame, right? 90% of everything is shipped. So these ships are constantly moving around our oceans. Shipping has increased since the 60s, particularly in this area in the Indian Ocean, where the main artery through the Indian Ocean, everything from Singapore to Dubai moves through this area, right? So that's one kind of problem we see. Then the other thing is obviously you'll get acoustic pollution. That's a huge issue as well that we do not talk about, right? We don't ever consider, because when we get into the water, go for a swim or a snorkel, we see the colors and the fish and we think it's beautiful, right? But for animals that live their lives really listening to their world, acoustic pollution is a huge issue. And that's something that we are documenting right now. And it is a problem. And in studies in the US, where they've been doing it for a longer period of time, they've shown that increased levels of noise increase the amount of stress in these species. If you increase the stress, that can have knock-on effects on their basically whether they can have babies or not, for example. So that's another issue that we'll see. And then coming to chemical pollution or just pollution in general, right? Now everyone's obviously thinking about the express pearl. This is the hot topic at the moment, with all good reason. And one of the things is that we've seen, so there's been chemicals spilled. That's one thing. I'm not a chemical expert, but I have been talking to chemical experts from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, for example. And, from their experience working with these kinds of incidences, the chemicals are a localized effect. They'll spill, they'll dissolve in the water, or they'll get burnt off, right? So that's the impact of the chemicals, short-term, localized. But with these pellets that we're seeing right now, obviously there's potential for ingestion. Now, there is no research to show that these microplastics can necessarily kill a large whale, for example. They are filter feeders. They do take mouthfuls. They'll take these microplastics. There are microplastics in the ocean anyways. I want people to remember that. Now we're shocked because we are seeing them in concentrations over a small area. But in general, our ocean is full of microplastics. So these animals are constantly ingesting them. It's the larger plastics that can actually cause lacerations of the stomach that can potentially cause death, or it can fill the stomach so much the animal is not getting nutrient value and it can die. So those are the ways these larger plastics can have an impact, right? So the point being, and then of course, if there's an oil spill, right? Oil spills are also problematic. If the animals can't move, if they're very localized and dependent on an area, then things like oil spills become a problem. So the key thing for us to remember is the ocean. There's a lot of threats happening out there. Some of them are very visible. Some of them are very visible in the short term, but many of them are also very invisible. Entanglement, there's all kinds. We find lots of our individuals have entanglement scars from fishing nets, either ghost fishing gear or deliberately caught, thrown nets and stuff. Then on top of that, we'll have things like they will find lesions. We find a lot of lesions, right? So we don't know anywhere in the world, we don't know the cause of these lesions, but small animals that have been found with these lesions are known to have died. It could be a smallpox virus, for example, they can die. So it's a wide range of issues that they face in the oceans. But shipping is a multifaceted problem, and I think it's a good one to drive home today as we sit here in the middle of the disaster that we're in right now.
Yeah, and one of the key things that I understood from your discussion is, one thing is that incident that we have all been discussing in the past week or so, it's just one incident. There are so many long-term issues that are out there that we need to understand properly and assess properly. And assessing the issue with the incident is also clouded with all these other dynamics that are happening out there. So we need to really understand the issues, the long-term issues, as well as short-term incidents like this, and their long-term impact. If we want to do something really positive, something really lasting, with a lasting effect. And you also mentioned fisheries, Asha, some of the threats that are out there due to fisheries. I know Daniel has been working on this for a long time with sharks and rays. You have been working with the fishing communities as well as land. You are working in landing sites. So, what's your experience? What can you say us about the negative impacts of fisheries that are out there?
Yeah. So when we think about fisheries, well, first, what I would like to say is that if we have effectively managed and sustainable fisheries, pretty much any negative impact can be greatly decreased or mitigated. The other thing that I would like to highlight, as Asha mentioned, for example, there are these short-term issues that are on lots of people's minds. But for example, this short-term issue that's currently taking place is not going to make the sharks and rays extinct. But fisheries at this current rate is certainly going to do that. Because the reality is very different to this idealistic world of effective management and sustainable fisheries. As I mentioned earlier, we have this rampant overfishing that's causing the decline of so many different sharks and rays, but also a lot of other species. And this is largely due to the fishing techniques that we are using. For example, the gill nets, they're capturing, a lot of cetaceans as well. Seabirds, as Ranil mentioned, is another big issue that is not often discussed, but these species are being captured even in fisheries. And certain techniques also destroy critical habitats. So, for example, the bottom trawling impacts the seagrass beds, which, again, as Ranil mentioned, is incredibly critical for a lot of species as a nursery ground as well. And then, as somebody previously alluded to, these are migratory species. So we can't just take into account the fishing pressure that we are putting from Sri Lanka, but also all the fishing pressure that's coming from the neighboring countries in the Indian Ocean. Sri Lanka is definitely one of the largest fisheries in the Indian Ocean, but there are many others as well with similar scales. And yeah, so taking all this into account, what I would say, the primary negative impacts of fishing is first and foremost probably on the species itself, which then has a cascading impact throughout the marine ecosystem. It also has direct impacts on the habitats, which of course the species are co-dependent on. So you kind of have this negative feedback loop that occurs. But ultimately, all of this also impacts the fishers and the communities that are dependent upon this resource. And that's something we also have to take into consideration. And we cannot really be blaming fisheries on its own, because ultimately it's each of us that are there consuming the fish and wanting to buy this fish. So, our demand also is quite often outnumbering the potential sustainable level of supply. And while all this sounds quite depressing, I would like to stress that there is definitely hope. For a few species, unfortunately, we may be on the border of being too late, but for many other species, there is still hope. But unfortunately, we have probably waited a bit too long to have adequate management in place, and there will have to be some degree of compromise. We probably won't find a solution that will keep both the wildlife and the livelihoods or the associated fisher communities happy, but we do need a compromise. We have to achieve long-term sustainability, because if we don't, we face a future with both collapsed fisheries and, of course, collapsed fisher livelihoods. And, for those of you who like seafood, no seafood to eat.
True, and ocean is one of the largest resources that we have, and utilizing the resource in a sustainable manner is totally our responsibility, responsibility of the people, as well as the authorities that are who are managing these resources. So, other than fisheries, we are also using the Sri Lankan oceans for tourism activities, especially when it comes to whales and other marine mammals. We do a lot of whale watching and other marine-related tourism activities as well. Ranil, I know you have been working with these tourism communities before, with your work on dugongs and other marine mammals. So, what have you found out regarding the impact of tourism and the status of the threat that is on marine mammals?
Yeah, when it comes to the tourism component, what I've seen as a threat to marine mammals has been really people not adhering to the standard protocols of whale and dolphin watching. So they sometimes, when they see a whale or dolphin, just to satisfy the client with them, they sort of harass the whale. They go after it. Whereas the international protocols state that you have to keep minimum between 50 to 100 meters away distance from the whale and not go after the whale. But if it comes towards you, you basically, keep your engine on idle and, wait for the animal to come to you. But these I have not seen happening. Though it's ironic because we conduct responsible whale and dolphin watching workshops in Kalpitia, Mirissa, and in Trinco, and that happens in collaboration with the Whale and Dolphin Conservation and several other organizations. Though we go in there and sort of try to change their mindset and tell them the do's and the don'ts, but we're yet to see them actually putting this to practice. But I'm not saying that all whale and dolphin watching boats operators do this, but it's something similar to what happens in Yala, what happens in Mirissa. Whereas Kalpitia, they are slightly better, because you don't get many boats going out to see whale and dolphin watching. It's about, maximum during the season is about 10. But whereas in Mirissa, I know Asha knows much better than me when it comes to Mirissa, you get 30, 40 large boats. Whereas in Kalpitia, it's the much smaller boats. And also what I've seen personally is, the boat operators and the people on board have to be educated, especially the people who man the boat. Because we have seen people, dumping plastic bottles. These are not the boat operators or the people, who are affiliated to the boat. These are basically their clients that they take on board, throwing plastic bottles, bags, even, they have the apple, but, the remaining of the apple is basically biodegradable, but still they throw it into the water. So these sort of things have to be, brought to light to them and, educated. And also we have to have some sort of mechanism to have at least some responsible entity, a person from responsible entity like the Department of Wildlife Conservation or even the Coast Guards on each boat so that, they can basically monitor what's happening. I think that will sort of reduce the impact, and threats to marine mammals from whale and dolphin watching in Sri Lanka as a whole. And also they will sort of, stop harassing the animals if possible to, stop them, chasing after blue whales or even the dolphins or the sperm whales or any other cetacean that they encounter. So that is very, very important. And also, since of late, a new thing had been, where people go out to sea to sort of what they call, watch and to observe pelagic birds. And, the only way you can attract them is, by obviously, put in the offal of fish, because they basically come to the looking for the smell of the fish oils and so on. So if that also can be curtailed in a there have been instances where people have basically thrown the entrails of the fish along with the plastic bag, just to attract the animals, because that won't happen. So it's good that these things are happening, because the more more people go out to sea, it's better for us to and it'd be easy for us to conserve the marine resources that we have and also educate people. So if we can also, sort of put a tap on that as well, observing, when they go out to sea, even watch on pelagic bird watching tours to make sure that, basically, bring back all the waste they take rather than just dumping it out at sea.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, again, as we discussed before, you need to utilize the resource, but you need to be conscious and you need to do it in a sustainable manner as well. Moving on to more conservation applications. Can maybe Daniel, if you can explain us about the sustainable fisheries, how fisheries can be conducted in a sustainable manner that where the negative impacts on marine life is mitigated.
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, sustainable fisheries is something that we should be aspiring to. But let's just approach this from a slightly different angle, right? So if you're looking, for example, at any fish or any wild animal for that matter, essentially, pretty much any animal can be harvested sustainably if it's managed properly. Now, of course, we may choose not to hunt certain animals due to ethical or legal reasons, animal welfare concerns, intelligence, sometimes perceived intelligence. But if we set all these concerns aside, any wild animal could be harvested sustainably as long as we ensure that we are not taking too many. Because the moment we take out too many, we disrupt the role that they play within a marine ecosystem. And for some fish, we could when we take into consideration their life cycles, it may mean that we can only take one animal a year or even less. For others, it may mean thousands or even millions. And this is where science-based management, along with effective implementation, plays a critical role. It requires the consideration of where we catch our fish, how we catch our fish, and even how it's stored, transported, exported, because all of that, of course, has an impact on how much we are catching as well. And we also have to remember that this process differs quite a lot, for example, from farming or from aquaculture, because in the wild, nature dictates and it fluctuates. There are lots of changes, and therefore our management advice also has to be able to adapt and change over time. And as I mentioned previously, none of this will be easy. There is no easy answer. It will require compromise on the side of the fisher to change fishing techniques, probably catch less, but also for the consumer, who must be willing to consume less and pay this additional premium for sustainable seafood. So in a nutshell, I would say that the fisheries industry can be sustainable and can be incredibly sustainable, but what we need is this clear science-based management throughout the chain, from the ocean to the plate, to ensure that it's successful.
Yeah, again, it's a two-way process where we need to consider many different aspects. When you do sustainable things, you have to also have compensate on certain angles, and there are many other limitations as well. So doing fisheries or any other resource utilization sustainably is not easy as it sounds, but it's a thing that we should be moving toward. So moving on to other conservation implications, especially with the research that need to be conducted to assess the marine life and to conserve marine life. That's really important, especially as Daniel also mentioned, the conservation should be any management should be based on science. So Ranil, can you discuss a little bit on that from your point of view? What kind of research needs are out there, and what kind of data, what kind of scientific studies should be conducted to manage and conserve these marine life?
I would say first, to get a whole picture, to conserve a species, first of all, we have to know what status it has. So the data that we have, apart from a few species like the blue whale, the sperm whale, and the dugong, humpback dolphins, apart from that, we don't have a rough sort of estimate of then there are numbers in our waters, when they come into our waters, and also at the same time what sort of impact the fisheries has on them. Because after the studies done in the early part of 2000 by Anuk, there's hardly anything that has been done on the bycatch of small cetaceans in Sri Lanka. So we basically are in the process of instigating a project, where we monitor the bycatch and the impact of fisheries on small cetaceans in some of the fish landing sites around the country. But we do have, through our research, we know what the impact is on the dugong, the humpback dolphins, and the finless porpoise, because we have been studying them for over 10 years now. So we have a rough consensus of what we have seen is the main threat, I would say, for small cetaceans today in Sri Lankan waters would be, when it comes to dugong, it's basically for their meat. And when it comes to the other, like the dolphins, their meat is used for shark longline fishing. And also, if they're unable to sort of say they don't have a good catch and they do come across a pot of dolphins, the fisher won't hesitate to take a dolphin or two, and the meat is sold not in coastal villages but inland. And this has been highlighted even by Anuk. And so even the little preliminary studies that were done in the last year or two, last year before, prior to COVID, we have seen that what they do is basically the meat is sold in the inland fish markets. So there is a demand not only for small cetaceans, even for turtle meat and also turtle eggs. So what I say is to conserve a species, first of all, we should know what is the impact and assess what sort of population we have, and also get a sort of a rough estimate of the seasonal abundance, and based on that we can move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Ranil. And again, this So, Asha, what's your point of view on the involvement of citizens in these science and conservation activities?
My bad. I was on mute. I recognize that. So yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for asking, because it's something that we've been doing at Ocean Swell, really trying to open out opportunities for people to get involved in the science that we do. So we have lots of different things, and I wanted to just highlight them. One is we do, obviously we have a really massive photo identification database of all the species. So we have species, all the large species that you think about, whales, blue whales, sperm whales, Omura's whales, Bridie's whales, but even pilot whales, bottlenose dolphins. We have an extensive database. All we ask is the tail fluke of a large whale or the dorsal sides, either side of any of the species. And we've been including that in a database so that we can come up with population estimates. And we're working with the International Whaling Commission right now to try to come up with these population estimates using these numbers. Now, the reason we use photo ID is we see an animal, if we can recognize it based on these long-term scarring patterns and markings, and then we know if it's coming back again and again, or if we're seeing new individuals every year, right? So that's really, really important. And we've been getting photographs from a lot of people who've gone whale watching. So anyone out here, even out there, who wants to contribute, please feel free. You can contact us through our social media. The other thing is strandings, dead animal reports, right? We've been collecting those we actually have a database that goes back to 1884. So from the first known cetacean stranding, we've been collecting this data. Again, it gives us a sense of where these animals are seen over time. And sometimes we can even ascertain the cause of death if we have good photographs. Again, we can tell you how to get it to us, what we need. So just keep following our work. Then another thing is, reporting new sightings. So the picture of the elephant seal came up. That's really important, right? Our teams can't be everywhere all the time. And that's the point of having a great citizen scientist group of people out there, is recognizing everyone has the talent to contribute. Everyone can be part of the science. And here are ways you can be involved. And so when that elephant seal turned up, the commander of the Navy actually sent me a picture immediately and said, what is this, right? Because people were like, we don't know what's in the water. So I was able to identify it. And then after that, because I knew what it was and that was there, I was able to help the authorities with understanding what would happen next and how to kind of manage the situation. So that's also really important for us, because that's how we find out about new species on our coastlines, right? And so if people keep their eyes peeled, keep watch, let us know of incidents. Even with the pilot whale stranding, massive event, obviously the community out there were the heroes. They went out and did all the mad hard work. But the point being that, I was able to be there and at least advise them on very simple things. So for example, something we would take for granted, that the blowhole is on the top of the head and that's where they breathe from. And you can't obstruct that in a rescue operation, was something that they didn't know. So just being able to tell them that, help them to be more successful in their endeavor to save this pilot whale population, right? So that's really important as well. So there is a way for citizen scientists to come together with experts to actually produce really good quality data, but also to protect the species along our coastline. And finally, I'm going to go back to the point that Ranil made about, tourism, right? Like we've got about 3 papers in the making right now about whale watch tourism in Sri Lanka. And yes, we all want to go see wildlife. We all want to go out and have a look. I'm not going to lie. I love it, but I know everybody else does too, and I'm never going to say no. What I am going to say is be respectful. This is their home. These species, that's the home that they live in. You don't want people coming, throwing plastic and throwing garbage in your home. Same way, don't throw garbage in their home. Treat them with respect. Don't get too close. You don't want someone standing so close to you when you're trying to do some work. They don't want someone standing so close to them either, right? So we have to learn to respect the species that live amongst us, in and amongst us, and recognize that we're part of nature, right? So we have to work in sync with everything around us. We are not superior in any way or form, right? I think Daniel mentioned that there's intelligent and perceived intelligence. Sometimes I question that, right, in terms of humans. But the point being, I think we can all be much more responsible in our interactions with any species that we're seeing. It's not just the marine species, it's also terrestrial species, right? If we can be more, the stress that we cause by trying to get too close, the stress that we cause by trying to handle and hug just to get that Facebook photograph is immense. And we need to learn to be much more respectful in these situations about how we deal with these animals. So there's lots of ways for everyone to get involved. And also just tell everybody the stories you've heard today. I mean, the ocean is 70% of our planet, but most people don't know what happens out there. And the stories you hear in spaces like this, in panels like this, but also in a 3-day, 4-day event like this, are things that not everyone will know. So your responsibility is also to share the stories of what we have in our waters so more people can fall in love. And that's a huge way anyone can get involved in taking care of what's out there.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Asha. And we have about maybe 1 minute more. So just to wrap things up, there was one audience question on the sperm-based superpods in Sri Lanka. Maybe Ranil or Asha, if you can share your experiences and knowledge about that, that will be really helpful. We have about 1 minute. Briefly, please explain that.
Okay, 1 minute is like, I probably used my 1 minute by just saying all of that. But I'll say something quicker. Maybe Ranil can add if he needs to. That's okay. But one thing I want to point out, and I think the question was about, where are they coming from, why these pods happen. But I just think we have to take it one step back. And I want to remind people that sperm whales are kind of like elephants, right? They tend to be very matriarchal. And so what we see in our tropical waters are typically females with their young, right? So we will see males coming in at breeding time. But other than that, what we're seeing is these massive gatherings are typically females. What we're finding from our research is that they're typically much older females, and they're young that use our waters. And then when the time is right, the males will come, because the males will mature and they will go off. So like an elephant, males mature, they go off to better feeding grounds, so to speak. They go off in like bachelor groups, hang out with the boys, right? When they're ready, they're like, right, gotta go mate, gotta find a girl. Then they head back to the tropical areas to find those ladies, right? So that's how it works with whales and sperm whales and elephants. There's so much more to say, but I know my 1 minute's up.
Thank you very much, Asha. And no, there's one more question that we can maybe ask that one as well. This goes to Daniel, and there's an audience question, Daniel, regarding the percentage of fishing resources within our EEC that is harvested by Sri Lankan fishing industry. So can you provide any input regarding that? Percentage of the resources that we are utilizing?
Percentage of utilizers we are resourcing in the ocean. That's a very tricky question. It's probably as complex as asking how much forest is being lost on a daily basis in Sri Lanka. We don't know that on land. Looking at what's happening underwater is a whole different scale. What we do know, of course, is what is being landed. So if I'm not mistaken, I think it's somewhere around 400,000 tons that's being captured on an annual basis. But we also know that a lot of the data is probably being underreported. There aren't enough surveys being conducted and not enough assessments. So as to the true scale of fisheries and our impact on the ocean, and of course we have to remember, as mentioned by so many others, there are issues of bycatch, ghost fishing, and all of that. It's really hard to say, but the impact is definitely incredibly severe.
Yes, and I think it's the general outcome. Based on what you have discussed so far, even though that we know a reasonable amount, especially when it comes to marine mammals and maybe a little on sharks and rays as well, there are so much that is out there that we really don't have a proper idea. So we need to study these. We need to do more research and do more scientific work to understand the situation where we can build our management practices. So that's the bottom line where we should be working on to improve the living status of all these animals that are out there in our ocean. So thank you very much, all of you, Dr. Asha, Daniel, and Ranil. Thanks for your inputs. I know you have been very helpful over the past few days for the summit and for the success of this present session. And we'll be wrapping up the session because we have another session coming up at 4 o'clock. There'll be a session on marine ecosystem restoration efforts in Sri Lanka, where our members will be discussing the projects that are out there, projects that have been we have been conducting the corporates in Sri Lanka, so where you can learn more on the efforts that are out there to conserve these marine life. And thank you very much for joining with us. I hope you all enjoyed the session on threatened marine species. And thank you, Dr. Asha, Ranil, and Daniel, for your valuable inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amila. Thanks, guys.